When the flames swallowed my neighborhood whole, I thought I'd lost everything. My home, my memories, my sense of safety. What I didn't know was that a quiet man in a black jacket would appear out of the chaos, and his actions would leave a mark on all of us that the fire could never erase. It started as just another sunny day in Los Angeles, with clear skies and the faint hum of distant traffic. But by noon, the horizon was a thick wall of smoke, and the air tasted like ash. The fire, which had started days earlier in the hills, had torn its way toward our streets, unstoppable and merciless. Evacuation orders were blaring, people were screaming, and the once friendly neighborhood turned into a scene of panic and desperation. And then, amidst the chaos, he appeared. At first, no one recognized him, just a man moving quickly, his face obscured by a cap and a scarf pulled over his mouth. But as he lifted an elderly neighbor out of harm's way and organized volunteers with calm precision, whispers began to spread. Wait, is that Keanu Reeves? What followed wasn't just a story about survival. It became a testament to the power of compassion and courage in the darkest moments. And though not all of us made it through unscathed, the lessons of that day, and the quiet strength of one man, left an imprint far greater than the devastation left behind by the fire. This is the story of how a Hollywood star became the hero we never expected, and why we'll never forget him. As the fire crept closer, swallowing everything in its path, the panic in our neighborhood became palpable. Families were packing what little they could into their cars. Pets yelped nervously, and the air was thick with more than just smoke. It carried fear. I had barely managed to shove a few photo albums and important papers into a bag when I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and panicked shouts nearby. That's when I saw him again. The man in the black jacket, his face partially hidden, moving with a calm urgency that seemed almost surreal in the chaos. At first, no one could believe it. Who would expect a Hollywood A-lister to be running into smoke-filled homes, rescuing animals, and helping neighbors carry their belongings to safety? But it wasn't the cameras or the headlines that brought him here. This wasn't a movie. This was real. And Keanu Reeves was risking his life alongside us. Watching him, I couldn't help but think, he doesn't owe us this. Why is he here? Before we dive deeper into how this incredible day unfolded, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story, and if this tale of humanity and courage resonates with you, hit that like button. Trust me, this journey is going to tug at your heartstrings in ways you won't expect. Keanu didn't just act. He inspired. When the fire threatened an elderly neighbor who had refused to leave her home, he didn't waste time arguing. He simply carried her out, gently but firmly, and reassured her with a quiet, "You're safe now." That moment sparked something in all of us. Strangers who had been frozen in fear began to move, stepping up to help each other in small but meaningful ways. It was as if his courage was contagious, spreading through the crowd and replacing despair with determination. As I followed him from house to house, helping where I could, it struck me that this wasn't just a story about one man's heroism. It was about how one person can ignite hope in others. It was about how, even in the face of overwhelming loss, humanity has a way of rising to meet the challenge. By the end of that harrowing day, we had all changed. And it wasn't because of the fire, it was because of the quiet strength of one man who showed us how to be better when it mattered most. The fire roared like a living beast, devouring everything in its path. The heat was unbearable, the air so thick with smoke that every breath burned. I stood frozen in front of Mrs. Clara's house, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She was 85 years old, stubborn as ever, and refusing to leave the home she had lived in for decades. "I've seen worse," she said, her frail hands gripping the doorframe like her life depended on it. But this wasn't something we could argue our way through. The fire was closing in, and every second counted. That's when Keanu stepped forward. "Ma'am, I promise I'll keep you safe," he said, his voice calm but firm, without hesitation. He bent down and gently lifted her into his arms. She protested weakly, but there was something about him, his quiet confidence, his unwavering focus that made her stop. I followed close behind, my heart pounding as the flames crackled ominously nearby. The world felt like it was falling apart. Yet somehow, his presence made me believe we could hold it together. As we carried her to a neighbor's car, a group of panicked residents began to gather around us. "What do we do?" someone asked, their voice trembling. Keanu didn't hesitate. "We need to organize," he said, scanning the crowd. "Get everyone out of their homes. Check on the elderly, and make sure pets aren't left behind. If you have extra water, bring it to the main street. Let's move." In that moment, something shifted. The chaos began to subside, replaced by a sense of purpose. People who had been paralyzed by fear started moving, following his lead. I watched in awe as Keanu directed volunteers with the precision of someone who had faced countless crises before. He wasn't just helping, he was inspiring others to help too. But the day was far from over. Just as things seemed to settle, a terrified child ran up to us, tears streaming down his face. "My dog! He's still inside," he cried, pointing to a house engulfed in smoke. Without a word, Keanu handed me his jacket and sprinted toward the house. "Wait!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. The crowd fell silent, holding their breath as we waited. Minutes felt like hours. Then, through the haze, we saw him emerge, coughing and cradling a small, trembling dog in his arms. The boy ran to him, sobbing with relief. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching his dog tightly. Keanu just nodded, a faint smile on his face. By the time the sun began to set, the fire had consumed several homes. But thanks to Keanu's leadership, many lives and hopes had been saved. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were now working side by side, carrying water, rescuing animals, and loading belongings into cars. I found myself standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, united by a common goal: survival. Later that evening, as we stood on the street watching firefighters battle the flames, I turned to Keanu. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. He paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the inferno. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. There was no hint of self-importance in his voice, no desire for recognition. It was just who he was. That night, as I lay awake on the floor of an evacuation center, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. Keanu's actions had been extraordinary, but what struck me most was the way he had brought out the best in everyone around him. He didn't just rescue people. He reminded us of our own capacity for courage and kindness. And in a world that often feels so divided, that reminder was the most powerful gift of all. But the fire wasn't done with us yet, and neither was Keanu. What he did the next day would cement his place in our hearts forever. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. By dawn, the fire had advanced even further, reducing entire streets to smoldering ruins. The air was heavy with ash, and the once familiar neighborhood now looked like a war zone. Despite the early morning light, everything felt cloaked in shadow. People huddled in small groups, their faces streaked with soot and fear. But amidst the devastation, one figure stood out: Keanu Reeves, calm and composed, his presence like a steady beacon in the storm. As people began to gather around him, Keanu quickly assessed the situation. Supplies were dwindling, and the evacuation centers were overcrowded. Many families hadn't yet made it out, and the blocked roads made it nearly impossible for rescue teams to reach us. We needed a plan. "All right," Keanu said, his voice cutting through the tense murmurs. "We can't wait for help, we have to help ourselves. Let's divide into groups. One team will check every house on this block to make sure no one's left behind. Another will clear debris from the main road so emergency vehicles can get through. And we'll need people to organize supplies: water, food, anything we've got." His words carried an unspoken authority, and no one hesitated. It was remarkable to see how quickly people responded, driven not just by fear but by the sense of purpose he instilled in them. A man who had been frozen in shock just minutes before now stepped forward to lead the road-clearing team. A teenager, clutching a backpack, offered to distribute water bottles. Even the most vulnerable found ways to contribute, whether by comforting frightened children or organizing makeshift shelters. Keanu didn't just give orders, he worked alongside us, pulling fallen tree branches from the road and helping load an injured neighbor onto a makeshift stretcher. His energy seemed boundless, even as the smoke thickened and the heat intensified. At one point, I noticed him pause to adjust a bandana over his nose and mouth, his face streaked with sweat and ash. But his eyes remained steady, focused. The turning point came when we discovered a family trapped in their home. The flames had crept dangerously close, and their front door was blocked by fallen debris. As we approached, we could hear muffled cries from inside. A mother, father, and two small children, their fear palpable. Keanu acted immediately, rallying a few volunteers to help clear the door. The smoke was so thick that we could barely see, and the heat was suffocating. "Hold on, we're coming," Keanu shouted, his voice firm yet reassuring. It took every ounce of strength we had to move the debris, but we managed to pry the door open just as the fire began licking at the edges of the house. Keanu went in first, disappearing into the darkness. My heart raced as I waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, he emerged, carrying a small boy in his arms, followed closely by the mother and father, who clutched their crying infant. The family's relief was overwhelming, and as they collapsed into each other's arms, the crowd erupted into cheers. That moment changed everything. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive had transformed into a collective mission to protect and support each other. Keanu's actions reminded us that we weren't just victims of the fire, we were a community, and together, we were stronger. As the day wore on, the makeshift teams grew more organized. The road-clearing crew managed to open a path wide enough for an ambulance to get through, and a group of volunteers began delivering supplies to those who couldn't leave their homes. Keanu seemed to be everywhere at once, carrying water to exhausted neighbors, comforting a woman who had just lost her home, and even cracking a small smile when a rescued dog jumped into his lap. But not every moment was triumphant. Late that afternoon, an explosion shook the neighborhood as a gas line ruptured in a nearby home. The blast sent debris flying and ignited a new wave of flames. Panic threatened to take over again, but Keanu quickly brought us back to focus. "We've come too far to give up now," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let's keep going." With renewed determination, we worked together to contain the fire as best we could, using hoses, buckets, and whatever tools we could find. The firefighters were stretched thin, but when they finally arrived to assist us, they were amazed at what we had managed to accomplish. "You've saved lives today," one of them told Keanu. He simply nodded, deflecting the praise. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us." As night fell, the flames began to recede, but the battle was far from over. Our neighborhood was scarred, our homes reduced to ashes or standing precariously amidst the wreckage. Yet amidst the destruction, there was an undeniable sense of hope. We had faced the fire together, and we had survived not just because of one man, but because he had reminded us of the strength we already had within ourselves. Sitting around a makeshift camp that night, exhausted but united, we shared stories of the day's events. Someone handed Keanu a cup of water, and for the first time, he allowed himself to sit down, his shoulders sagging with fatigue. A child approached him hesitantly, clutching a small, charred toy that had been rescued from the rubble. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Keanu smiled softly and ruffled her hair. "You're brave, kid," he said, "braver than me." As I watched him interact with the people he had helped save, it struck me that heroism isn't about grand gestures or seeking recognition. It's about showing up when it matters most, putting others before yourself. and inspiring them to do the same. Keanu didn't just organize the neighborhood that day. He gave us something far more valuable. He gave us hope, and that hope, I realized, would carry us through whatever came next. As the night deepened, the fire showed no mercy. What little progress we had made during the day felt futile as strong winds fanned the flames, pushing them closer to the last standing structures in the neighborhood. The evacuation center, a local school that had become a refuge for families, children, and the elderly, was now directly in the path of the inferno. The sight of the fire's glowing edges inching closer sent waves of panic through the air. For many, felt like the end. In the midst of the chaos, Keanu Reeves stood as calm as ever, scanning the situation with a focused intensity. He turned to the group of volunteers, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need to move fast," he said, urgency lacing his words. "There are people inside that school who might not make it out in time. We can't wait for help to arrive." There was no hesitation in his tone, no room for doubt. He looked at me and a few others standing nearby. "Who's with me?" Without a second thought, I stepped forward, along with 3 other neighbors who had been working alongside us all day. We quickly armed ourselves with whatever we could find: damp towels, makeshift masks, and a fire extinguisher someone had salvaged earlier. As we approached the school, the air grew hotter, and the smoke thickened, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The roar of the fire was deafening, but through it, we could hear faint cries for help. "We'll start at the back," Keanu said, leading the way. His steps were steady, purposeful, as though he'd done this 100 times before. Inside the school, the scene was harrowing. Families huddled together, some coughing from the smoke, others clutching what little they had managed to bring with them. A mother held her baby close, trying to calm its cries, while an elderly man sat slumped against the wall, his face pale and exhausted. The fire was dangerously close now, and the heat was stifling. Keanu wasted no time. "We're getting everyone out," he announced, his voice firm but reassuring. "Stay close, follow the person in front of you, and cover your nose and mouth with a wet cloth if you can. Let's go." With that, we began ushering people out, one group at a time. It was chaotic: children crying, people stumbling in the darkness. But Keanu's presence kept everyone moving. At one point, I saw him lift a boy who had collapsed from the smoke, carrying him as though he weighed nothing. "You're going to be okay, buddy," he said softly, his words steady and calm. As we moved through the building, clearing one room after another, the fire continued to advance. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke burned our eyes and throats. Just when we thought we had everyone, a faint voice called out from down the hall, "Help, we're here!" Without hesitation, Keanu turned and ran toward the sound, disappearing into the thick smoke. My heart sank as I watched him vanish. "Keanu!" I shouted, but he was already gone. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes as we waited, the fire inching closer with every passing moment. Finally, through the haze, we saw him emerge, carrying a young girl in his arms. Her face was streaked with soot, and her tears had carved clean lines through the grime. Behind him, a woman, likely the girl's mother, stumbled forward, coughing but alive. Keanu handed the girl to me, his voice hoarse but steady. "Take her. Get them out of here." As we guided the last group to safety, the fire consumed the outer edges of the building. The roof groaned under the heat, threatening to collapse at any moment. Keanu stayed at the rear, making sure no one was left behind. Just as we reached the exit, a loud crack echoed through the air. The ceiling above us began to give way. "Move!" Keanu shouted, pushing the group forward. We sprinted toward the door as debris rained down behind us. The heat was searing, the smoke suffocating, but somehow, we made it out just as the roof caved in. Outside, the families we had rescued gathered, holding each other tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the muffled sobs of those who had escaped. Then, as if on cue, a cheer erupted from the crowd. People clapped, hugged, and cried, their gratitude palpable. Keanu, covered in ash and sweat, simply nodded, his expression humble yet resolute. As the firefighters arrived to contain the blaze, Keanu quietly stepped aside, leaning against a nearby tree to catch his breath. I approached him, my own heart still racing from the ordeal. "You saved them," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "We saved them," he replied, his gaze drifting toward the group of volunteers who had stepped up when it mattered most. That night, as the fire began to lose its grip on the neighborhood, we all gathered at the evacuation center. The mood was somber yet hopeful. Families reunited, neighbors embraced, and strangers shared stories of survival. Amidst it all, Keanu remained a quiet presence, helping where he could and offering words of comfort to those who needed them. At one point, a little boy approached him, holding out a small, charred drawing of a dog. "This is Max," the boy said shyly. "You saved him." Keanu knelt down, taking the drawing with a soft smile. "Max is a lucky dog," he said, "and you're a brave kid." It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person he was. Someone who didn't just step up in times of crisis but also took the time to make others feel seen and valued. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel grateful, not just for surviving but for witnessing the quiet heroism of a man who had reminded us all of what it means to truly care for one another. The fire may have scarred our neighborhood, but it couldn't destroy the bond that had formed between us. And at the center of it all was Keanu Reeves, a man who didn't just save lives but also reignited our faith in humanity. By dawn, the fire had finally been contained, leaving behind a haunting silence. The streets were blanketed in ash, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. What was once a vibrant neighborhood now lay in ruins, homes reduced to charred skeletons, memories scattered among the debris. Yet, amidst the destruction, there was a sense of something remarkable, hope. We gathered outside the evacuation center, our faces weary but alive with gratitude. The flames had taken so much, but they hadn't taken us. People exchanged hugs, tears, and quiet words of thanks, the kind of raw emotion that only comes from surviving something together. In the middle of it all stood Keanu, his once black jacket now gray with ash, his face streaked with soot but calm as ever. He moved through the crowd with quiet humility, offering a reassuring word here, a helping hand there. I found myself watching him, trying to understand what drove someone like him to give so much without expecting anything in return. He had no obligation to us, no reason to stay and risk his life. And yet, he had, not for glory, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the wreckage, a woman approached Keanu with tears streaming down her face. She clutched a small, charred photo frame in her hands. "This was all I could save," she said, her voice breaking. "You made sure I had time to get it. Thank you." Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, his words soft but steady. "Sometimes the smallest things mean the most. I'm glad you have it." That moment seemed to capture the essence of what he had done for all of us. It wasn't just about the lives he saved, though those were countless. It was about the hope he gave us, the way he reminded us of our own strength and our capacity for kindness, even in the face of unimaginable loss. As the day wore on, Keanu quietly prepared to leave. There were no grand farewells, no dramatic speeches. He simply nodded to those nearby, a faint smile on his lips. When someone tried to thank him, he waved it off with his characteristic humility. "You did this," he said. "All of you. I was just here to help." And then, just as quietly as he had arrived, he was gone. For a moment, it felt as though we had imagined him, a fleeting presence in the chaos. But the impact of his actions was all around us, in the way neighbors now spoke to each other, in the laughter of children playing despite the ashes, in the determination to rebuild what had been lost. As I sat that evening, Looking out over what remained of our neighborhood, I realized that Keanu hadn't just helped us survive. He had given us something far greater, the belief that even in the darkest of times, humanity could shine its brightest. And though the fire had left scars that would take years to heal, his actions had left something far more enduring, a legacy of courage, compassion, and hope.